Welcome everybody to Deloitte's Debrief Tax webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Global Mobility and Talent Reward series. And in the next hour or so, we will be focusing on the results from Deloitte's recent Global Remote Work Survey. My name is Sarah Vun, and I am a tax director based in Deloitte, Australia. I have the absolute pleasure of hosting and presenting to all of you today. With me are my co-presenters, Alicia Azapati, a tax senior manager, and Paul Rubenstein, a tax partner. Both are also based in Deloitte, Australia. Now you may access our bios on the left side of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the key features of our webcast console. Firstly, please ensure you are all on the listen-only mode. Also, if you have any content-related questions, you absolutely can submit these at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen. We'll do our very best to respond to your questions during the course of the presentation. Secondly, all PC users, you can maximize or minimize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen. Now, if you would like to download today's slides, please go to the download and links box. On the other hand, mobile device users can view the slides on screen. And thirdly, if you require an attendance record for this event, you will receive an automated email with CPE certificate after watching for 40 minutes. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today. Our agenda today will focus on 7 key areas. We're going to start with some macro trends. We're going to talk a little bit about a workforce in distress. We're going to talk about talent challenges. Then we're going to talk about what is this thing called borderless talent and how remote work fits into all of that. Then we're going to take a deep dive into the Deloitte Global Survey results on remote work. We'll then finish off with next steps for organizations. And of course, we're going to leave some time for a Q&A section. The next slide, please. At a macro level, in the APAC region and globally, we have workforces which are in distress. Despite record investment in digitization, productivity growth is actually quite sluggish. Sourcing critical talent is a #1 priority for many organizations to navigate future disruptions. But currently, the education system is really falling short of future needs. Unrefined hybrid and/or remote working also risk worker isolation and unhealthy prosperity. Now, these factors are compounded by employees wanting more meaning in their work. So what I've just outlined are just some of the factors that point to workforces that are in distress. Next slide, please. If we hone in on the talent challenges of a distressed workforce, we can also see that at a macro level, there is a global shortage of skills that are needed to drive transformation. New capabilities are needed to add value where machines fall short. So with this broader context, in a recent Deloitte survey that was conducted, 90% of CFOs continue to cite difficulties in securing and retaining talent, and this for them is a real business risk. Now, in addition to the challenges at the CFO level, employee expectations around where they work are shifting, and employers must adapt if they wish to attract, recruit, and retain key talent. Another survey that Deloitte has done, 73% of employees are demanding flexibility to work remotely. Now, whilst working remotely is very much the norm at the domestic local level, employee demand to work remotely internationally and across borders is also on the rise. Next slide, please. So in light of a distressed workforce, and more specifically, in light of the talent challenges that many organizations are facing, recruiting talent from a global talent pool will start becoming much more common. And at Deloitte, we call this borderless talent. Where specialist expertise or experience, for example, is not available in the local market, organizations will start to look abroad and to recruit from abroad. During COVID and post-COVID, remote work was largely an employee-driven request. However, over time, and given the macro trends we just spoke of, remote work will become more of a business-driven requirement to enable borderless talent initiatives. Next slide. And what this next slide really does highlight is the fact that remote work is not standing still. This slide outlines where remote work is going. Over the next few years, we will start to see remote work expand beyond what it is today. Today, most organizations either have ad hoc remote work requests or they have remote work policies, but it's only for a very short period of time and with many, many restrictions. And we'll see some of these themes as we dive into the survey results a little bit later. But what is next on the horizon for remote work is not only employee-driven scenarios, but also business-driven scenarios. And when you look at this slide, as you move down to the bottom of this table, we're also seeing organizations starting to be asked by the business and employees to consider longer term or even permanent remote working arrangements. And again, the drivers for this eventual expansion of remote work arrangements are because of the macro trends that we had talked about earlier. Workforces are in distress. There are real talent challenges, and harnessing the power of a global talent pool is becoming more and more of a business imperative. And therefore, this really expands the role that remote work has to play in enabling borderless talent. Next slide, please. So in light of the expanding importance of remote work programs for organizations, Deloitte has recently released its global remote work survey results. And these survey results captures what organizations are doing as of today. But it also really does highlight that many organizations still have a very long way to go on their remote work journey. In our Deloitte survey, we had more than 820 participants across 45 countries. We surveyed large, medium, and small organizations. We also surveyed a cross-section of organization types, ranging from global organizations to regional and local organizations. Next slide, please. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see that the cross-section of industries that we surveyed. We have representation from industries such as consumer, financial services, and technology. And on the right-hand side of this slide, participants surveyed were largely, yes, from the tax and HR functions, closely followed by the mobility and finance function. Next slide, please. And in the Deloitte survey, where we surveyed more than 820 participants, 5 key emerging trends came through. And some of these key trends should be no surprises to you. The first key trend that emerged from the Deloitte survey is that a majority of organizations, yes, are enabling remote work. But whilst at a headline that seems obvious, what's interesting behind that trend is that most organizations, though they are enabling remote work, they are also at the very beginning of the journey. We've not seen many organizations which are more at the mature end of the journey. Now, the second trend that is emerging from our Deloitte survey, remote work is predominantly driven by talent pressures. So remember, once upon a time, no one really worked remotely or was very rare, but COVID accelerated that, right? So remote work became the norm because of personal requirements. However, today, the reason why there is more remote work emerging is because of talent pressures that is lined up with talent strategies and business growth. So it becomes more of a business imperative. So there is a step change in terms of what is a driver behind remote work. The third key trend that we've seen is that many organizations are really experiencing this tension when designing a policy because there are absolutely competing priorities between talent demands, what the employee wants, versus managing an organization's risk and compliance requirements. And the fourth key trend that we're seeing is that many organizations are implementing a combination of guardrails to address legal and compliance risk. And the fifth key trend that has emerged from the Deloitte survey, there is a real gap between policy inception and rollout, and the ability to really operationalize and enforce remote work processes. As the risks become clearer, so does the gap between policy and practicality. From the survey results, we can see that leaders are really struggling to enact remote work policies that really does enhance the talent and culture strategies, whilst also managing their complex business and tax risk. And so over the next few slides, we will take a deeper dive into some of the key results from Deloitte's remote work survey. And so I'm going to hand it over to Alicia to talk through some of the key details around the remote work surveys. Over to you, Alicia.
Thanks, Sarah. Firstly, and rather importantly, I do want to highlight a few really key statistics, the ones that many of you on the call will be expecting to see, and that at a high level really give us a view of where the market is at the start of 2023 on remote work trends. Our survey results show us that of the respondents, 35% of organizations globally are allowing international remote work. Now, although not an insignificant number, especially when you look at the diversity of respondents that we had in our survey, at initial glance, some might see that 35% statistic as a little bit low. Of course, what that statistic isn't showing us is the number of organizations who don't have a documented policy or a process in place, but they are on an ad hoc basis and often with quite a time investment from their HR, their mobility and their tax functions, permitting exceptional ad hoc requests and responding to individual employee and in some case business-driven requests for remote work. If we spotlight on the APAC region just for a moment, what's really interesting is that there's a small bump up to 37% of organizations within the APAC region saying that they're permitting international remote work. While there will, of course, be a number of reasons for this, it's likely that the different legal and, of course, cultural landscape for people within the APAC region is a significant driver. And if we deep dive even further into that statistic, what we know from our respondents is that of those allowing international remote work, 60% of organizations have implemented a workday threshold. 17% are allowing unlimited international remote work days, and 23% are yet to determine a workday threshold for their employee population. This concept of a workday threshold is something that all organizations with remote work policies and those looking to introduce policies are watching quite carefully, not least because it tends to be a headline-grabbing number and it's quite a key takeaway that sticks in the minds of employees. Our survey showed that between 10 and 30 days is where the vast majority of organizations are sitting. What we've noted is that more often than not, organizations tend to decide on the allowable number of days based on internal discussions, often between talent, HR, tax, legal, risk, and others. Organizations do take into account feedback received from employees and the business, but the ultimate driver is the need to balance that feedback with risk, reporting, and other regulatory and compliance requirements. As a side note, a number of our clients have reached out and highlighted that a small number of global organizations are allowing employees to work from anywhere in the world for as long as they like. And what our survey results show us is that these organizations are really within the minority. I think the percentage that we've got on our slide there is 17%. We will discuss this in a little bit more detail, but it is likely that it's driven by a number of factors, including increased tax and regulatory requirements. And whilst we haven't touched on industry-specific stats in this slide, we have really looked into the data. And whilst we do see some small variances across industries, overall, there's not a huge difference. If we turn now to domestic remote work, we note that a large number of respondents, 66% of organisations that we surveyed, do allow domestic remote work. This is a significant increase from those allowing international remote work. What we've noted from discussions with our clients within the region is that domestic remote work doesn't, at first glance, have as many hurdles, both from an operational perspective, but also from a compliance and a regulatory perspective. So it is in many ways easier to implement and to track. What's interesting to see is the almost even split between organisations implementing a time restriction on remote work travel and those allowing unlimited remote work days at a domestic level. Let's now take a look at some of the challenges organisations are experiencing when approaching the design of a remote work policy. Next slide, please. When we're working with organisations, it's common to see different stakeholders within the business coming at things from different angles and often with really different priorities. For example, talent wanting perhaps a little bit more flexibility as opposed to tax and mobility functions, which are often a little bit more cautious as they're aware of compliance and regulatory constraints, which might require additional consideration by the business. In reviewing our survey results, our survey showed the top 5 challenges facing many organisations, with organisations able to pick more than one response. In first place, and probably not surprisingly, is policies and regulation. Second place, we have navigating cultural challenges within the business. And in third place, we have dealing with compliance around remote work. These were followed up really closely by uncertainty with strategy and approach, and tracking and management, which we discuss in a little bit more detail later. Interestingly, what we saw in the survey is that organisations are rolling out fresh new policies. So they're not typically relying on pre-pandemic or even pandemic policies. And of those, the majority of organisations, so 70% that have a policy in place, have a single global policy, with 30% of organisations adopting local country policies for remote work. What's really interesting to see is that the majority of organisations are adopting a consistent approach to their remote work policies. Deloitte's view is that organisations should develop an action plan that addresses current and future potential compliance risks. Organisations need to implement guidelines and guardrails around remote worker policies, including eligibility criteria, approval routes, location identification, and associated due diligence. It's essential that organisations adopt a holistic view to enable individual cases to be controlled and assessed, and that there's appropriate tracking and management. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Alicia. Regarding tax and legal compliance, I think it's fair to say that once remote work crosses international borders or even domestic borders, it inevitably brings with it a degree of complexity. What this slide shows, and I actually think it shows it pretty well, is that it's not even one area of tax and legal that we need to consider. It's across multiple areas, including, as you can see, permanent establishment risk, transfer pricing, indirect taxes such as GST and VAT, intellectual property, employer obligations, personal tax issues and filings, employment law, and last but not least, immigration and work permits. What we find is that all of these tax and legal compliance risks create a natural tension, as Sarah Vaughan mentioned previously, a tension between trying to provide remote work arrangements to a broad cross-section of your employees and one that effectively manages the risks of the company. As with a lot of things in life, we at Deloitte think the answer is balance. Policy can't be too open so as to put the company at material risk, but it also cannot be so strict that it limits remote work arrangements to just a few employees. When Deloitte Australia was putting together our remote work policy, we found this balance by including some of the common guardrails that Sarah and Alicia have already mentioned. 1, limiting it to countries where the employee is a citizen or permanent resident holder. 2, limiting it to specific countries that have already been vetted for material corporate tax and legal risk. I should add, we deliberately selected key countries based upon anticipated demand from our people, such as the UK. And finally, limiting days that can be taken under remote work arrangements. These days were higher or lower based upon the specific country and based upon the relative risk of that country. Implementing our policy in this way allowed a lot of our team to firstly reunite with family after the global pandemic, and now allows our people to take a mix of holiday and remote work so they can have extended breaks with family and friends. At the same time, having these guardrails in place has effectively managed any material risk for the firm, as well as ensuring that we don't create any significant compliance administration, such as the need to register or operate any shadow payrolls in country. I should add that we review the policy and country combinations on a regular basis to ensure that we continue to manage these compliance risks on an ongoing basis. Next slide.
Thanks, Paul. Really quickly, I wanted to share a little bit more on the cross-border policy guardrail results from our survey, which Paul just touched on. It's unlikely to be surprising that organisations rolling out remote work policies and those considering rolling out remote work policies are thinking about necessary guardrails to not only protect the business, but also provide limitations around what employee movements and participation within that policy itself. What our survey results showed us is that the immigration right to work was the top guardrail there, with 64% of those organisations with policies including this guardrail. Where we have supported clients with implementations and landing on those policies within the business, it's been really important to work closely with their change and comms teams to land the right to work message. What that message means and educating potentially a whole workforce on the difference between business travel and remote work, which is a really important part of the implementation process. It's often difficult enough to educate a workforce on what business travel looks like. So the added complexity of now considering remote work travel is often really challenging. This is especially true for organisations within the APAC region, who we often see have an incredibly diverse employee base and whose employees are looking to reconnect with family and friends in the post-pandemic environment. Our second guardrail there, which we've briefly touched on already, is the day limits which may be applied by organisations. On this particular guardrail, the devil really is in the detail, and different organisations will have different definitions for this. For example, limiting the number of overall requests that an employee can make in a period. Many organisations will define a year in different ways, or ask that remote work is undertaken in fixed blocks. This will be largely driven by business needs, tax compliance, and may also be driven by employment law aspects, which some organisations might not have considered. Looking at our third place there, we have eligibility criteria, with 48% of respondents indicating that this guardrail was implemented by them. Specifically, the way that this particular question was answered was requiring an individual to be an employee and excluding any contractors. Now, landing on this item as a guardrail will be linked to many things, not least the different, or even in some ways, the unknown compliance complexities that having contractors in scope for a remote work policy might trigger. But it will also be cultural and quite standard for organisations to exclude contractors from certain policies. Again, there are often multiple reasons for developing certain guardrails, so it can be both compliance driven but also business driven too. And lastly, what we see here is that it's not just tax and immigration aspects around the guardrails, but it is also employment law aspects. These are around time frame, repeated periods or patterns of time, working from another country. And so it's really important that businesses are aware that they might be creating an employment law footprint in another country, regardless of the jurisdiction stated within the particular employment contract. Organisations should really look to seek additional guidance and advice before approving a remote work request of this nature. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Alicia. So on to our next key challenge and what it means for remote work. In our remote work survey, both culture and alignment with company strategy were in the top 5 challenges cited by our respondents. When we assist our clients with developing their remote work policies and indeed developing our own, we always start with why. Why is the company looking to implement a policy or policies? That is, what are they looking to achieve? Having this North Star to constantly refer back to allows companies to make policy and compliance decisions, as well as balancing the compliance risks as noted on the previous slide. In our global survey, we asked what your reasons were for wanting to implement a remote work policy. Perhaps not surprisingly, more than 80% of companies said they wanted to enhance the employee experience and provide greater flexibility and choice for their employees. In terms of alignment with culture and strategy, we're seeing a move to more flexible and hybrid work arrangements for a lot of employees in many companies. For these companies, a flexible cross-border remote work policy will be an important addition to this suite of tools for an aligned and consistent corporate culture. In these circumstances, we are finding that some companies may even be prepared to incur some additional costs and provide benefits to their employees in order to support their remote work policy. On the other hand, some companies either require or are looking to promote workplace attendance and may choose a different approach to their overall workplace policies, including their remote work policy. 59% of companies said they were looking at remote work policies as part of a broader talent and attraction strategy. It is critical to stay close to business leaders and talent leaders to understand what the demands are and ensuring that policies address and are aligned with these key demands. Whether it is to provide your company with a point of differentiation or just to ensure you remain competitive with attracting and retaining scarce resources post the global pandemic, a remote work policy can be a centerpiece for your overall talent strategy. Finally, I want to draw your attention to a surprising stat that really talks to challenges that companies will face in this space, and also to the fact that policy and compliance owners for remote work and business travelers can often lie in different areas of the business. As you can see on screen, 45% of companies are not addressing the interaction between remote work and business travel. With business travel ramping up and similar challenges presented around the tax and compliance risks, it is likely that over time companies will start to revisit and align these two policies. Next slide.
Thanks, Paul. As Sarah mentioned, one of the key findings which came out of our survey is that organisations are wanting to surface and roll out remote work policies, but are really struggling to operationalise these policies. Organisations are trying to define guardrails to manage risk for the business, but the management and enforcement of those guardrails is still very much a work in progress. When looking at tracking and assessment, and as you can see on the left-hand side, less than half of organisations that responded to the survey are tracking all remote work requests, with just over a third reviewing each case before choosing to accept or decline a remote work request. As Paul mentioned, most organisations we've seen are really struggling to handle the interaction with business travel and don't have steps in place to validate if the employee has, for example, returned to their usual country of work. We know that these aspects take huge amounts of SME time out of the business, and that's often on top of business as usual traditional mobility activity and the post-pandemic upturn in business travel. As you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, Most organizations are not currently utilizing technology to support remote work programs, or where they are, the tools that they're using don't have an assessment functionality, and so they're not always sure that requests are being dealt with swiftly or consistently. Additionally, what our survey results showed us was that 57% of respondents that use technology do not perform any checks on employee locations and were unsure if any checks were performed at all. What these results show us is that where technology isn't used, many organizations are having to use their people to ensure remote work requests are reviewed and responded to. And where technology is used, it's limited in its capacity, which again can open up organizations to unknown compliance and regulatory risks. Turning now to approval routes within organizations. Next slide, please. For those that responded to this question, the vast majority indicated that line manager or business unit leader approval was required, with other approvers including talent, HR, and compliance approvers within tax. Some organizations are applying additional scrutiny. For example, there may be an additional requirement to check work rights, confidentiality, and privacy aspects. What we've also seen is that the vast majority of approval processes are manual in nature. So the employee may need to reach out to their line manager or business unit leader and are then required to reach out to another member of the business once initial approval is received. As Paul touched on, Deloitte Australia implemented an international place flex policy last year. This policy allows employees with certain work rights the ability to work in a select number of overseas jurisdictions for a specified time period. In terms of approval, Deloitte has implemented a multi-step approval process, which interestingly is part manual and part automated. It does start with approval from a coaching partner or lead engagement partner, so very much keeping in theme with the line manager or business unit leader approvals that we saw within the survey. And once approved at that level, employees must then submit a formal request via an internal system, which is then reviewed by an operating unit leader or our chief operating officer. Once that approval is received, the request is then reviewed by talent to ensure appropriate work rights have been met. What we can see is that approval processes are really varied within organizations and not one size will fit all. Next slide, please.
So in terms of the survey results that we've focused to date, we are really focusing on what organizations are currently doing as of today. But what this slide really outlines is what organizations should start to consider if they wish to really mature and evolve their remote work program, particularly in light of the strong business demands and macro trends that we had talked about earlier. Right now, only 23% of organizations are considering virtual assignments. However, if you as an organization wish to really progress and evolve your remote work journey, you may start to consider more virtual assignments on the cards. Secondly, most organizations as of today, and as we've talked about already, are really sticking to a 10 to 20 day threshold for remote work. Not many are yet starting to consider the longer term international work arrangements. But there may be a time when extending beyond 10 to 20 days will be required, and organizations may just need to start accepting the additional compliance costs, compliance admin, to extend those days beyond 10 and 20, and the driver behind that to really try and deliver on business and talent imperatives. Thirdly, as organizations start to mature in their management of remote work programs, they also may start to think about alternate employment models. Currently, however, 3 out of 5 organizations do not leverage alternate employment models to manage cross-border remote work cases. Most organizations as of today are currently working within their current employment arrangement, within their current corporate structures, And that makes sense because some of the requests today are purely employee driven for very short periods of time. There's very limited compliance requirements because of the guardrails in place. Again, over time, as we scale and increase remote workers required to drive business and talent imperatives, companies may need to start considering alternate employment models to manage the remote work program. So with this in mind, this slide really does outline if you do want to evolve your remote work program or to mature it, these are some of the things that you could start to consider. And in the next slide, so next slide, please. This next visual gives you a picture of a snapshot of what a mature remote work program could look like. A mature remote work program could consider employee-driven moves, which are largely considered today, but overlaid with more business-driven moves. And also, given the difference between employee-driven moves and business-driven moves for remote work requests, what are the different types of approaches that may be taken for each type of move? Another tenet of a more mature remote work program would also consider different timeframes for the remote work arrangement. Again, organizations right now are focusing on 10 to 20 days, which is very limited, but there may be critical projects or critical business imperatives whereby a remote work arrangement is needed for more medium term, maybe 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or even a more permanent arrangements. So these are some of the things that are over the horizon, and a evolved remote work program will start consider these broader elements, having short-term, medium, and also longer-term timeframes to be considered and managed. And lastly, a mature or evolving remote work program would also consider the different compliance items that will be need to manage under each different scenario. Of course, for those which are very short-term, employee-driven, where there's very limited and additional compliance or additional admin regulation costs, maybe for those particular scenarios is very straightforward. But then the compliance requirements or regulation required for longer term or more permanent arrangements, there needs to be programs and processes in place to actually manage those as well. So what this slide really gives a snapshot is potentially what your future program could look like. And for all of us today, perhaps identify where you are today as an organization, and does this future look like some of the items that you will need to also consider to really help drive those talent and business imperatives. Next slide, please. And of course, Deloitte can help organizations wherever you are in terms of your remote work journey to enable that borderless talent initiatives. So Deloitte has a cross-function of teams from human capital to risk advisory to tax to really help support organizations wherever you are in your remote work journey. Next slide, please.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Before we finish our presentation and invite your questions, we want to leave you with our 5 key takeaways. 5 things that we think all companies need to do to make remote work work. Number 1, firstly, align to organizational strategy. I spoke about this earlier, but understanding why you are looking to implement a remote work policy and approach and for who will make it easier to build the policy, processes, and compliance frameworks that will be accepted by the business and employees alike. Seeking cross-stakeholder input and buy-in is critical in this regard to ensure that the policy is fit for purpose. Number 2, assess the risk and understand your red lines. By this, we are saying that you should stress test scenarios that are specific to your employee population against risks that are specific to your organization. This includes tax and compliance risks, taking an appropriate and balanced approach to technical risk and practical approaches, as well as business risk. By this, I mean how a remote work policy will work in practice for the effective operation of your business. Number 3, you will need to identify the routes to enablement. By this, we mean that there may not be a one-size-fits-all, off-the-shelf approach that can be applied on a global basis in every country and for all employees. What you will likely find is that the approach to enablement will need to be adapted to local markets, job roles, and business units. It will also be critical to ensure that there are clear processes and employee and business communications to support your policies. Just go to the next slide. The fourth takeaway is to determine how best to track and govern remote workers. As the employee take-up of these arrangements increases, many companies will look to technology solutions to help facilitate the approval process and document compliance, as well as to monitor potential tax and compliance triggers. This may be something as simple as a days count tool to technology that can approve or reject remote work requests based on a mix of country compliance and company policy requirements. And the final takeaway is to stay connected to the long-term strategy and employee experience. By this, we mean that the world can change very quickly, and it's important to regularly review your company policies, both individually as well as their interaction with other company policies and strategies around reward, talent, and your employee value proposition. Sarah, over to you to sum up.
So I think that does bring us to a close to the formal part of our presentation in terms of the results from Deloitte's Global Remote Work Survey. So I do want to now take a moment to open up to the floor for some questions that we're happy to help support and help answer in the next couple of minutes. So if you do have questions, please absolutely do write in some of your questions and we'll help field. Now, one of the questions that I can see coming up is with the guardrails that we spoke about earlier, there's a question around, does this apply to having similar time zones taken into account when you allow a remote work request? So Alicia, what are your thoughts on this question from the team?
That's a really great question, so thank you. I think the short answer is that yes, it is taken into account. I know it's not specifically been called out within our presentation, but you know, what our clients and in fact really what our people internally at Deloitte are telling us is that similar time zones are actually really important for a number of reasons. So just to name a couple that I can think of, you know, it might be a requirement for servicing particular customers or clients who operate in that particular time zone of the home organization, for example. So keeping that, or you know, a very similar time zone to your home organization might be important for, you know, servicing those particular customers or those particular clients. And I suppose internally from a team perspective, you know, remaining connected with team members and colleagues is really important, and that can be quite a significant challenge when you're working in really varied time zones. So you know, being able to connect with your people, you know, perhaps if you've got, you know, people that report into you, it's really making sure that you're still able to connect with those people. So yeah, absolutely, the same or similar time zones are really taken into account when looking at guardrails and also looking at you know, the implementation and I guess the design and the approach of a remote work policy. Paul, Sarah, not sure if you had anything further to add on that one.
Alicia, I might just add that. I was going to say in relation to the Deloitte policy, as I mentioned previously, you know, we've got far and wide locations such as you know, the UK, and that's obviously in a significantly different time zone to Australia. We do find that we can still make it work with more limited connections, and also there are some benefits of this as well in terms of a project that can effectively be run around the clock rather than in the one country. So there are swings and roundabouts with everything in life.
Thanks, Paul and Alicia. Now I've got another question that has come up. Previously, I mentioned if you want to mature your remote work programs, you may start thinking about virtual assignments. Only 23% are only doing that. So Paul, maybe share with the team what's a virtual assignment.
Look, I think we're starting to see these a little bit more. They didn't exist too much, you know, a year ago. But the way I'd define a virtual assignment is where the workplace is not where the employee is currently located, as simple as that. So that Typically, we see it where they remain in their home country, but are assigned to a role in another country or another location domestically, and work from there. And that presents some challenges and compliance issues. But again, these are manageable and something we are likely to see more and more. And we've actually seen a number of companies, in addition to a temporary remote work policy, implement permanent remote work policies.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Now, we've got a great question that may be really relevant for many organizations. And the question here is, what are the obligations for workers' compensation and remote working if there's a personal request? And maybe if I expand that further, is there a difference between a personal request versus a business-driven request? So, Paul, maybe you can take this one. What are the obligations for workers' compensation and remote working when there's a personal request?
I don't know if we're talking about workers' compensation, the tax, or in terms of what we do in terms of REM, but in terms of obligations to the employee themselves, I hope that's what we're looking at if it's a personal request. I would say, again, it would refer back to the policy and whether this is something that the company is actively encouraging is in order to differentiate or in the market, and there might be some items that are provided to the remote worker in that situation. But again, that it might be that because it's a personal request, the individual would need to provide all of the or manage all of the costs associated with that remote work opportunity themselves. So again, it's a bit of horses for courses, and different companies are doing different things around it.
So maybe on that point, this probably speaks to a little bit around insurance and just protecting our people. So whilst at Deloitte, we obviously would like the employees per personal request to take out insurance to cover themselves, but ultimately Deloitte wants to do right by its people and will ultimately, if it is required, also extend that out to look after their employees. But this may differ given different organizations and how their culture is, and in terms of the value employee proposition. So I've got another question that's also come up. So there was a mention that there was not a lot of variation by industry in terms of the remote work results. The question is, was there a lot of variation by geography, especially in APAC? Thoughts on that, Alicia and Paul? So
Well,
maybe
I don't
Paul,
know
you
if you
can.
wanted to start.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah, do you want to just repeat that?
Sorry, I can answer this one. Was there a lot of variation between geography? So what we did see in the survey results in the Asia Pac region, it was very, very conservative, limit remote work to 10 to 20 days. So that was very much the norm. But when you contrast these statistics with, say, the European countries, and by the nature of the European countries, how they're set up, there is much more flexibility and there is much more freedom of movement within the European countries to work in different places quite easily. So when you compare the APAC results with the European locations, the APAC is definitely much more conservative and limited, but in the European countries, it is much more extended. Up to 30 days was more the norm in European locations because of the freedom of movement. So
I
we've
might
got
just add
probably,
that,
yeah, yes, Paul.
Australia might be a really good example there, where we're so far away from another country that it might take 10 days before you're over the jet lag before you are effective. So it means that remote work might be different for Australia than it might be, as you say, within the Europe geography.
And I think we've got another question, and I'll just read it out for the benefit of the group. The section on businesses who have implemented remote work have said that domestic remote work was low risk or no risk. So perhaps, Alicia, if you can give an example of some of the types of risks that might arise for domestic remote work arrangements.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sarah. Now, if I think about that in maybe purely an Australian context, and I know that there might be kind of similar kind of tax regimes in other countries within the APAC region. But for Australia, for example, we've got a state-based tax system which is called payroll tax, and we have quite a number of states and territories within Australia. So payroll tax is payable in the jurisdiction where the worker is performing services. So what we found is that many employers are allowing domestic remote work, as we saw, but they're not actually updating, potentially master employee data or kind of, locations within payroll, etc., of when an employee does move to another state. And that, for payroll tax purposes, can give rise to an issue, not just in the state where the employee is now performing services, but also in the state where they were performing services. So, you've got potentially got an underpayment of tax and an overpayment of tax. So, that's just one example where, there is a risk within a domestic context. And, it is, again, up to employers to really make sure that they, when they're approving or reviewing these types of, remote work arrangements, that they are actually going to the next step, which is making sure that, for example, payroll is updated with the latest information, or that, employee master data is updated to make sure that it's complete and comprehensive for that point in time. And I know that example is specific to Australia, but, many of you on the call, I'm sure, have got a similar state-based tax within your country. So I can only imagine that, a very similar issue might arise where you've got that kind of domestic movement.
Alicia, something I'd add there is in relation to income tax, is that in addition to federal income tax, many countries have state or even city taxes, and again, those could be triggered by longer term remote work. So it's not just employer taxes, there might be employee taxes that need to be considered as well.
Thanks, Alicia and Paul. So what I might just ask and check whether there's any more questions from our participants for today. Now, if you have processed some of the things that we've talked through today and you come up with questions down the track, you can obviously reach out to any of us. We're absolutely happy to help support and field any questions that you may have post this webcast. But if I do not see any more questions coming through, we have gone through all the presentation, and we really do want to thank you for all of you joining us today. And I appreciate your time is valuable. So we appreciate you making the time. So we do encourage you, as we wrap up our presentation and webinar, that you fill out a short survey that will pop up on your screen momentarily and tell us what you think about today's program. You can also watch an archive on your PC or mobile devices via Apple Podcasts, RSS, and YouTube, and rewatch this webcast if you would like. And eligible viewers, you may now download your CPE certificates. Just click on the CPE icon on your left-hand side of your screen to get those numbers, to get those recording in. So if I go to the next slide, I do want to make sure that I let you know that on the 28th of March at 2 p.m. Singapore time, we do have another webinar from our corporate income tax team. And the theme and the topic for that next webinar is around global minimum tax, pillar 2. And then it's the how and the what, really critical. So if you do want to register for our next webcast, please go for more information on the link. Please click onto the link that's displayed on the screen. So without further ado, we are wrapping up our webinar today. Again, thank you so much for all your participation, and we'll see you until next time, everyone. Thanks, team.